The Galactic Concordance University hung in the void like a jewel someone had accidentally dropped into the cosmic washing machine. Twin suns bathed its spiraling architecture in alternating waves of gold and crimson, which would have been breathtaking if anyone aboard had time to appreciate it. They didn't. Most were too busy trying not to fail classes taught by professors who considered pop quiz and minor existential crisis to be synonyms. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Eliza sat in Lecture Hall 23B, which was less a room and more a monument to someone's ambitious interpretation of what a learning space could be. Holographic star charts floated above, while the seats arranged themselves in concentric circles that defied at least two laws of physics she'd learned back on Earth. Around her, approximately 200 students representing 60-something species fidgeted, chittered, hummed, and in one case, photosynthesized quietly in the back row. She was the only human. This fact had stopped being novel around week 3 of her first semester. Now, halfway through her second, it was just another item on her mental checklist, somewhere between remember to recalibrate gravity boots and avoid the cafeteria's Thursday special. Being the lone representative of humanity meant she'd become something of a curiosity, like an exotic pet that could do math and occasionally made sarcastic comments that didn't translate well into galactic standard. Professor Colmouth entered the lecture hall with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd either prepared an excellent lesson or was about to make everyone regret their enrollment decisions. Possibly both. He was what humans might generously call amphibious adjacent, with 6 limbs that moved independently, skin that shifted between blue and green depending on his mood, and eyes that could rotate in directions that made geometry textbooks weep. The good professor was known throughout the university for 2 things. 1, his groundbreaking research on cross-species behavioral patterns. 2, his teaching methods that made Russian roulette look like a carefully risk-assessed activity. "Good morning, sentience," Colmouth announced, his voice bubbling through a translator that made him sound like he was gargling marbles. "I trust you've all completed the reading on predator-prey dynamics?" A chorus of affirmative sounds rippled through the hall. Chirps, clicks, one deep resonant hum that Eliza felt in her bones, and what might have been interpretive dance from a gaseous student in the 3rd row. Eliza had done the reading. She'd done all the reading. Being the only human meant she couldn't afford to be unprepared. The species reputation thing, you know? No pressure or anything. "Excellent," Colmouth continued, 2 of his arms gesturing while the others manipulated a control panel that materialized from thin air. "Because today, we're moving from theory to practice." Next to Eliza, Olwyn made a sound like a wet sponge being squeezed. He was a molluscar, which meant he was approximately 80% anxiety held together by a gelatinous membrane and desperate hope. His species had evolved on a planet where the most dangerous predator was a particularly aggressive form of kelp, and it showed. "Practice?" Olwyn whispered, his translator rendering his panic in a pitch that only dogs and submarine sonar could typically detect. "What kind of practice?" "The fun kind, probably," Eliza whispered back, though her definition of fun and the professor's had historically diverged on several key points. 3 rows down, Fell turned her wedge-shaped head to glare at them. She was Sauron, built like someone had taken a velociraptor, given it an engineering degree, and then added a superiority complex that could be seen from orbit. Her scales gleamed under the lecture hall's lighting, all emerald and attitude. "Some of us are trying to learn, mammal," Fel hissed, her translator adding extra sibilance that was definitely not necessary. Eliza gave her a thumbs up, which she'd learned was either a gesture of approval or a declaration of war, depending on which side of the Andromeda spiral you were from. Fel's culture valued strength, honor, and looking down on species they considered soft. Humans, with their fleshy exteriors and lack of natural weapons, ranked somewhere below decorative houseplants on Fel's hierarchy of respect. The feeling was becoming increasingly mutual. Professor Colmouth pressed several buttons on his control panel with 3 different limbs simultaneously, which was showing off, honestly. The lights in the lecture hall dimmed to what a human might call ominous, and what the syllabus probably called atmospheric learning conditions. Today's lesson, the professor announced, concerns the topic of predator response and survival instincts across species. We've discussed theory. We've analyzed data. We've watched recordings that some of you found disturbing. Yes, Olwyn. We all saw you leave the room during the Nexu Prime documentary. Olwyn's membrane rippled with embarrassment, which in his species looked like someone was playing the bongos on a water balloon. But, Colmouth continued, and Eliza's internal alarm systems started going off because any sentence with "but" delivered in that tone never ended well. True understanding requires experience, visceral, immediate, memorable experience. A mechanical whirring filled the hall. 3 panels in the wall slid open, revealing alcoves Eliza hadn't noticed before. From these alcoves emerged 3 large containment units on automated tracks, each roughly the size of a small vehicle. They were made of reinforced transparent alloy, which was good. They were also vibrating slightly, which was less good. Something inside them was moving. "Oh no," Olwyn breathed. "Oh no, 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 no." Around the hall, students were having similar reactions in their species-specific ways. The gaseous student in row 3 briefly lost cohesion. Away, Crystalline, being 2 seats over, began emitting a high-pitched frequency that suggested either fear or an incoming phone call. Professor Colmouth looked pleased, which on his species involved all 6 limbs doing a little synchronized gesture that resembled either jazz hands or a threat display. Hard to tell. "Allow me to introduce," he gestured grandly at the containers, "our teaching assistants for today." Security protocols activated throughout the hall. Eliza watched as energy barriers shimmered into existence over the exits, emergency containment fields powered up along the walls, and what was definitely a medical drone deployed from the ceiling. The university's insurance premiums must be astronomical. The containers came to rest in the center of the lecture hall, arranged in a triangle. Through the transparent walls, Eliza could now see what was inside. Fang cubs, from Nexu Prime. 3 of them. "You've got to be kidding me," Eliza muttered. She was not being kidded. Nexu Prime was what happened when evolution got day-drunk and decided to speedrun the most terrifying apex predator category. The planet's ecosystem was so aggressively hostile that the tourism board's slogan was, "Visit Nexu Prime," or "Don't, we understand." Everything there had evolved to either kill you or make you wish it had killed you. And the fang cubs, even as juveniles, sat comfortably at the top of that murderous food chain. The specimens before them were sleek, muscular creatures about the size of Earth's big cats, which was already concerning. They had 6 eyes arranged in pairs along angular skulls that suggested intelligence behind the killing instinct. Their hide was somewhere between scales and fur, colored in patterns that would have been beautiful if not for the whole apex predator situation. Crystalline claws tipped each paw, capable of cutting through most known materials. And those were the features you could see. The features you couldn't see were worse. electromagnetic sensing organs that could detect a heartbeat from 50 meters away, vocal cords that produced sounds ranging from infrasonic to ultrasonic, weaponized across the entire audio spectrum, and pack-hunting intelligence that made Earth's wolves look like disorganized amateurs. As you can observe, Professor Colmouth continued, clearly enjoying himself, these specimens are juveniles, approximately 6 months old, still cubs by their species standards, but fully capable of lethal response. "Why do we have them here?" someone shouted from the back. Eliza thought it might have been the photosynthesizing student, which meant the situation was serious enough to interrupt someone's lunch. "Excellent question," Colmouth replied. "These cubs are on loan from the Nexu Prime Conservation Initiative. They've been fitted with inhibitor collars that limit their aggressive responses, and I'll be maintaining a behavioral dampening field throughout the exercise. Perfectly safe." Eliza had been in enough perfectly safe situations to know that those two words, when spoken by an authority figure with that much confidence, were usually a prelude to disaster. "The exercise is simple," the professor explained. "I'll release the cubs into the hall under controlled conditions. You will experience genuine predator presence while observing your own fear responses. It's one thing to read about survival instincts, another entirely to feel them activate in real time." Fell leaned forward, her posture screaming eagerness. Of course she'd be into this. Her species probably considered this a light workout. Ulwin, conversely, had begun secreting what Eliza had learned was his species' stress response, a thin, slippery film that made him glisten under the lights and smell faintly of regret and seaweed. "Please note," Colmouth added, "that while the cubs are controlled, they are still predators. Sudden movements may trigger chase responses. Loud noises may startle them. And under no circumstances should you attempt to touch them. We're here to observe, not to pet the nice murder kitties." Several students laughed nervously. Eliza didn't. She was too busy watching the cubs. They weren't pacing or snarling like she'd expected. Instead, they were alert, watchful, their 6 eyes tracking movements around the hall with unsettling focus. The one in the middle container had locked its gaze on her. That probably didn't mean anything. Probably. Professor Colmouth manipulated his control panel again. The containment units began to glow, their locking mechanisms disengaging with a series of clicks that sounded very final. "Remember," the professor said cheerfully, "this is a learning experience. Try to embrace the moment." The containers opened. For approximately 3 seconds, nothing happened. The cubs sat in their units, blinking in the brighter light of the lecture hall, taking in the assembled students with what might have been curiosity. Then the one in the middle made a sound. Low, resonant, testing. The other two responded, and Eliza realized, with the clarity that comes right before everything goes sideways, that something was wrong. The cubs' body language wasn't the dopey, controlled demeanor of sedated animals. Their muscles were coiled, ready. Their eyes were too focused, too intelligent. Professor Colmouth noticed it too. His skin flashed from green to a warning shade of purple. "That's odd," he murmured, checking his control panel. "The dampening field should be—" The middle cub exploded out of its container in a blur of motion that made several students scream. The dampening field wasn't working. The inhibitor collars weren't working. Nothing was working. And all 3 fang cubs, juvenile apex predators from one of the most dangerous planets in known space, were now loose in a lecture hall full of prey. "Well," Eliza thought, as chaos erupted around her, and Ulwin made a sound like a tea kettle achieving consciousness, "this semester just got interesting." The thing about Pandemonium, Eliza reflected, as a gelatinous student ricocheted off the ceiling, is that it never starts gradually. There's no polite crescendo, no gentle build-up where everyone calmly assesses the situation and makes rational decisions. No, Pandemonium kicks down the door, sets the furniture on fire, and starts juggling chainsaws while screaming its own theme music. This was that, but with more teeth. The first cub, the middle one, the one that had been watching her, landed in the center aisle with a grace that would have been admirable if it weren't so utterly terrifying. Its crystalline claws gouged furrows in the supposedly indestructible flooring, which said something about the university's maintenance budget, and also about how spectacularly screwed everyone was. The second cub went left, vaulting over 3 rows of seats in a single bound that defied what Eliza knew about muscle mechanics. The third went right, and suddenly, the lecture hall had become a very efficient demonstration of tactical pack formation. "Containment field!" Professor Colmouth shouted, all 6 of his limbs now frantically working the control panel. His skin had gone through purple, and was now cycling through colors that Eliza didn't have names for, which in the universal language of "oh no" probably translated to extremely "oh no." The containment field flickered, sparked, and did absolutely nothing useful. "Override! Emergency override!" The professor's voice had lost all its earlier confidence and gained several octaves of pure panic. Around the hall, 200 students representing 60-something species all had the same thought simultaneously. Get out? The problem was that the security protocols, designed to prevent dangerous specimens from escaping, worked both ways. The exits were sealed. The energy barriers that were supposed to protect them from the outside universe were now trapping them inside with 3 increasingly excited predators. The universe, Eliza had learned, had a truly spectacular sense of irony. A Soren student in the front row, not Fell, someone else, decided that the best defense was a good offense. He stood up, expanded his neck frill in what his species considered a threat display, and roared. It was actually quite impressive, hitting frequencies that made the holographic star charts flicker. The nearest fang cub paused, tilted its head in what might have been confusion or curiosity, and then made a sound that wasn't quite a roar, wasn't quite a purr, but landed somewhere in the vicinity of, "Did you just try to intimidate me, lunch?" The Soren student's threat display deflated faster than a balloon at a knife-fighting convention. He sat down very quickly. "Olwyn," Eliza said, keeping her voice low and steady, "I need you to not panic." Next to her, Olwyn had progressed from merely secreting stress slime to actively producing enough of it to create a small puddle. His entire gelatinous form was quivering like someone was playing the bongos on a water balloon filled with anxiety and regret. "Not panic?" Olwyn's voice came out so high-pitched that Eliza's ears popped. "Not panic? There are fang cubs, Eliza. Fang cubs. From Nexu Prime. In the lecture hall." "Yes, I'm aware. They're supposed to be controlled." "Also aware. We're going to die." "Let's table that discussion for later," Eliza suggested, watching as one of the cubs began stalking along the outer circle of seats, its 6 eyes scanning the students like a predator selecting from a menu. Across the hall, Fell had climbed onto her desk. So much for Soran warrior culture and its emphasis on bravery in the face of danger. Then again, Eliza noticed that Fell had positioned herself in a spot, with good sightlines and multiple escape routes. Not panicking then, strategizing. Give the reptilian credit where it was due. The flying species were having their own problems. A cluster of avian students had instinctively taken to the air, which in a room with a ceiling turned out to be a tactical error of magnificent proportions. They were now bonking into the walls, each other, and the still-floating holographic star charts, with sounds that ranged from comedic to concerning. One particularly panicked flyer crashed directly into a light fixture, which exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. The sudden noise and flash caused all 3 cubs to snap their attention upward, muscles tensing. "Nobody move," Professor Colmouth commanded, finally finding some of his professorial authority. "Remain calm. I'm attempting to reactivate the inhibitor collars." The leftmost cub made a chittering sound that its siblings echoed. They were communicating. Pack hunting tactics. Wonderful. A crystalline student, the one from 2 seats over who'd been emitting that high-pitched frequency earlier, decided that the best course of action was to make themselves very small. Their species could compress their molecular structure when threatened, which was usually an excellent defense mechanism. Unfortunately, the refraction of light through their compressed form created a brilliant, strobing effect. 3 pairs of 6 eyes locked onto the movement. "Stop that!" someone shouted. "You're attracting them!" The crystalline student tried to stop but couldn't. Their panic had triggered an involuntary response, and now they were stuck in a feedback loop of compression and light refraction that basically turned them into a predator-attracting disco ball. The rightmost cub began moving toward them, low and focused. Its body language had shifted from curious to predatory, that ancient hunter's focus that every prey animal in the universe recognized on an instinctual level. A group of students near the crystalline one scrambled backward, climbing over desks and each other in their desperation to get away. One of them, a methane breather in an environmental suit, moved too quickly. Their suit caught on a desk edge, tearing. The hiss of escaping gas was sharp and sudden. All 3 cubs' heads snapped toward the sound. Then everything happened at once. The rightmost cub pounced. The crystalline student, still strobing uncontrollably, managed to roll off their desk just as razor-sharp claws shredded the spot where they'd been sitting. The methane breather's suit alarm began wailing, which set off a chain reaction of other alarms, which set off the fire suppression system, which meant that sprinklers activated and suddenly it was raining indoors. Water and Ulwin's stress slime mixed to create a substance with the friction coefficient of buttered ice. Students who'd been running for the exits suddenly found themselves in an impromptu skating rink, minus the fun and plus the mortal peril. A mantis-like student from the upper rows, trying to leap to safety, miscalculated badly. They landed in the slime water mixture, skidded across 3 rows of seats, and crashed directly into Professor Colmouth. Both went down in a tangle of limbs, 6 from the professor, 8 from the student, all of them flailing. The control panel flew from Colmouth's grasp, skittered across the wet floor, and came to rest directly in front of the middle cub. The cub looked at it, looked at the assembled chaos, and if Eliza didn't know better, she'd swear the thing looked amused. "The collars!" someone shouted. "Check their collars!" Through the chaos, Eliza managed to get a clear look at the nearest cub's neck. The inhibitor collar was there, blinking with what should have been a steady blue light indicating active function. Instead, it was strobing red. Malfunction. Complete system malfunction. The leftmost cub had cornered a group of students against the back wall. They'd formed a defensive cluster, which was excellent teamwork and also completely useless. The cub wasn't attacking, not yet, but it was clearly enjoying the fear response, the way a cat might toy with a cornered mouse. Its siblings moved to flank the group. Pack tactics, coordinated hunting behavior. This was bad. This was very bad. "Security override!" Professor Colmouth shouted from the floor, still tangled with the mantis student. "Someone activate the emergency beacon!" "The panel's in the middle of the floor," Fel yelled back from her desktop vantage point. "With the cubs! Then someone needs to get it." There was a pause as everyone in the lecture hall performed the same mental calculation. Retrieving the panel meant crossing open floor space with 3 active predators. The math on that was not encouraging. "I'll do it," Fel announced, because apparently warrior culture and self-preservation instincts were having a fight in her brain, and warrior culture was winning. She climbed down from her desk, her movements controlled and deliberate. The middle cub, still standing near the control panel, watched her approach. Its body language shifted subtly, weight redistributing, muscles coiling. It knew a challenge when it saw one. Fel stopped about 10 feet from the cub. For a moment, predator and would-be warrior stared at each other. Then Fel did what her species had done for thousands of generations when facing a threat. She expanded her neck frill, planted her feet, and roared. It was a good roar. Eliza had to give her that. It hit all the right frequencies, carried all the authority of a species that had clawed its way to the top of its own planet's food chain through sheer belligerence and attitude. The fang cub was not impressed. It responded with a sound that started somewhere in the infrasonic range, climbed through frequencies that made Eliza's teeth hurt, and ended in ultrasonic registers that she couldn't hear but definitely felt. The sound carried information that bypassed logic and went straight to the lizard brain. "I am the apex. You are not." Fel's frill deflated. Her aggressive posture collapsed. For the first time since Eliza had known her, the Soran student looked genuinely afraid. The cub took a step forward. Fel took a step back. Another step forward. Another back. The cub was hurting her, Eliza realized, playing with her the way its species had probably played with prey for millennia. "Fel, get back!" Professor Colmouth shouted. But Fel was frozen, locked in some ancient predator-prey dynamic that overrode her warrior training and cultural conditioning. The cub's 6 eyes held her in place more effectively than any cage. It gathered itself to pounce. And then Olwyn, bless his gelatinous heart, did something extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily stupid, the line between the two being notably thin. He threw his datapad at the cub. The device spun through the air, trailing droplets of stress slime, and struck the cub square in the side. It wasn't a hard hit. Olwyn's species wasn't built for throwing things, but it was unexpected. The cub spun toward this new challenger, abandoning Fel in favor of the mollusk who'd dared to interrupt its fun. Olwyn made a sound like a squeaky toy being slowly crushed. The cub began moving toward them, and Eliza realized with perfect clarity that their row was about to become ground zero for a very one-sided altercation. Around the hall, the situation continued to deteriorate. The other 2 cubs had successfully cornered their group of students and were now testing the barriers, looking for weaknesses. The flying species had given up on aerial maneuvers and were clinging to the walls like terrified decorations. The fire suppression system continued to rain down water, creating an atmosphere that was part disaster movie, part nightmare, and part really bad day at school. Professor Colmouth had finally untangled himself from the mantis student and was crawling toward the control panel, moving with what he probably thought was stealth, but looked more like a 6-limbed panic wiggle. The security doors remained locked. The inhibitor collars continued to malfunction. And the middle cub, the one that had been watching Eliza from the beginning, abandoned its pursuit of Olwyn and locked all 6 of its eyes directly on her. The universe's sense of irony remained impeccable. The cub began stalking toward her, low and focused. Its body language had shifted again. This wasn't play or curiosity. This was assessment. This was a predator recognizing prey and beginning the hunt. Students in the adjacent rows scrambled away, creating a buffer zone of empty seats around Eliza. Even Olwyn, despite sitting right next to her, was trying to melt into his chair and possibly achieve quantum tunneling. The cub's muscles coiled, its claws extended. Its 6 eyes remained locked on her with the kind of focus that made it very clear that running would only trigger its chase instinct, and also that she'd lose that race badly. Time seemed to slow down, the way it does in moments where your brain realizes that the next few seconds are going to be really important, and you should probably pay attention. The cub gathered itself to spring, and Eliza, in what would later be described as either brilliance or insanity, again, thin line, remained perfectly still and raised her hand. Not in surrender, not in defense, just raised her hand. The cub froze mid-snarl, all of its predatory momentum suddenly interrupted by sheer confusion. Around the lecture hall, 200 students and 1 professor stopped their various panicking and escaping to watch what happened next. Eliza kept her hand raised, her eyes locked on the cub's, and spoke in a voice that was low, steady, and carried not a trace of fear. "Hey there, buddy. You look like you're having a rough day." The cub tilted its head, all 6 eyes blinking in sequence. Somewhere in the back of the hall, someone whispered, "Is she talking to it?" "I think she's talking to it." "That's the human, right?" "Yeah, that's the human." Are humans supposed to talk to apex predators? Nobody had an answer to that. Eliza kept talking, kept her hand up, and kept direct eye contact with a creature that could reduce her to component atoms if it felt motivated. And the cub, for reasons that would take the rest of the class to fully understand, didn't attack. It just stood there, frozen mid-snarl, trying to process why this particular prey item wasn't behaving correctly. In the suddenly silent lecture hall, with water still dripping from the sprinklers and emergency lights casting dramatic shadows, the human and the apex predator regarded each other with mutual confusion. Then, slowly, so slowly, that several people weren't sure they were actually seeing it, Eliza smiled. Time did that thing it does when adrenaline and consequence collide, stretched like taffy, each second containing multitudes. Eliza could hear the water dripping from the sprinklers, the ragged breathing of 200 terrified students, the hum of malfunctioning equipment. She could hear her own heartbeat, steady and controlled in a way that surprised her. The fang cub stood 3 meters away, frozen in that predatory crouch, trying to solve an equation its evolutionary programming hadn't prepared it for. Prey runs, prey screams, prey smells like fear, and triggers the ancient hunting protocols written into every cell of its body. This prey was doing none of those things. Eliza's hand remained raised, steady as stone. Her eyes stayed locked on the cub's 6-fold gaze. She'd learned this trick back home, back on the frontier colony where she'd grown up surrounded by fauna that could kill you before breakfast and still have time for a nap. The trick wasn't dominance. That's what most species got wrong. They thought predators respected strength, respected the biggest threat in the room. Sometimes, sure, but more often, predators respected something else entirely. Certainty. The cub took a tentative step forward, not attacking, exploring, testing. Eliza didn't move, didn't flinch, just kept her hand up and her breathing controlled, every exhale deliberate and calm. "That's it," she murmured, her voice pitched low, sliding under the frequency of panic that saturated the room. "You're not hunting. You're scared." Behind her, Olwyn made a sound like a balloon slowly deflating. "Scared? Scared!" Eliza, it has claws made of crystal. And it's 6 months old, in a strange place, with malfunctioning tech on its neck pumping who knows what into its nervous system, Eliza replied, never breaking eye contact with the cub. Look at it. Really look. The cub's body language, now that she was reading it properly, told the whole story. Yes, the muscles were coiled. Yes, the claws were extended. But the ears, those subtle ridges along its skull, were flattened back. Its weight distribution was wrong for an attack. Too much on the rear legs, ready to bolt as much as pounce. This wasn't a predator hunting. This was a juvenile animal, overstimulated and terrified, operating on pure instinct because everything else had failed. The cub made a sound, soft, uncertain. Nothing like the predatory calls from before. This was almost questioning. Eliza's mind flashed back to the research she'd done last semester, that deep dive into Nexu Prime ecology for Colmouth's assignment on extreme environment adaptations. She'd spent weeks analyzing recordings of fang cub family groups, studying their communication patterns, their social structures. She remembered the maternal calls, low frequency, pulsing rhythm, reassurance and safety coded into sound. She couldn't replicate it perfectly. Human vocal cords weren't built for it. But she could approximate. Eliza hummed, low in her throat, letting the sound resonate in her chest. The rhythm pulsed, steady as a heartbeat. Not quite right, but close enough that the cub's ears pricked forward. All 6 eyes widened. The cub took another step closer, and this time there was no predatory calculation in the movement. Just curiosity, confusion, the beginning of recognition that maybe, just maybe, this strange 2-legged creature wasn't a threat. Around the lecture hall, Eliza was dimly aware of movement freezing. The other 2 cubs had stopped their harassment of the cornered students, heads turning toward their sibling, toward the sound Eliza was making. Professor Colmouth, halfway to the control panel, had gone completely still, all 6 limbs locked in place. Fell, still standing in the open where the cub had abandoned her, stared with her jaw slightly unhinged. Eliza kept humming, kept her hand raised, and slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, began to stand. The cub tracked the movement, but didn't tense. Its body language shifted further from predatory to something else, something closer to what Eliza had seen in the recordings when cubs approached their mothers. She reached into her jacket pocket, moving deliberately, telegraphing the motion, and pulled out a small canister. Pheromone neutralizer, standard issue for xenobiology students working in lab environments. It masked biological scent markers, prevented cross-contamination between species samples. It also, Eliza knew, would eliminate the fear scent that every other person in this room was broadcasting like a dinner bell. She sprayed a small amount, the mist settling over her like invisible armor. The effect was immediate. The cub's nostrils flared, processing the change. The human prey that should smell like fear and adrenaline now smelled like nothing. An absence. A null space in its sensory map. The predatory programming that relied on fear scent to identify prey stuttered, crashed, rebooted with an error message. Eliza took a step forward. The cub didn't retreat. The silence that followed the final containment unit sealing shut was the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums. Not peaceful, too shocked for that. More like the entire lecture hall had collectively forgotten how to process what had just happened and was now buffering like a corrupted data file. Professor Colmouth broke first. All 6 of his limbs hung limp at his sides, his skin cycling through colors that Eliza was pretty sure didn't have names in any language. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. For a being whose entire career revolved around explaining things, he appeared to have misplaced all his words. The security team burst through the doors, approximately 90 seconds too late to be useful. Weapons drawn, containment gear ready. They surveyed the soaking wet lecture hall, the huddled students, the 3 cubs now peacefully secured in their units, and the lone human sitting calmly in row 12. The team leader's antennae drooped in confusion. "So," Eliza said into the silence, wringing water from her jacket sleeve, "about that reading on predator-prey dynamics." "What?" Fell exploded from her desk perch, scales bristling. "In the name of every sun in the galaxy was that?" The dam broke. Questions erupted from all corners of the hall, in 60-something languages, translated into a cacophony that made the earlier panic seem orderly by comparison. "How did you—" "The cubs just—" "Humans can do that." "Did she just make friends with—" Professor Colmouth raised 2 limbs for silence. It took 3 tries before the hall settled enough for speech. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something Eliza hadn't heard before. Genuine uncertainty. "Miss Eliza," he said carefully, "I believe the class would benefit from an explanation." Eliza shrugged, suddenly aware that 200 pairs of eyes, give or take, depending on species, were locked on her. "There's not much to explain. The cubs were scared. I helped them calm down." "Scared?" Fell descended from her desk, stalking toward Eliza with barely controlled agitation. "Those were apex predators from Nexu Prime. You don't calm down an apex predator." "Sure you do. You just have to understand what they're afraid of." "They're apex predators," Fell repeated, as if saying it louder would make Eliza understand. "They don't get afraid. They're at the top of the food chain." "Being an apex predator doesn't mean fearless," Eliza replied, keeping her tone conversational. "It just means nothing usually eats you. But malfunctioning collar, strange environment, unfamiliar creatures everywhere. Those cubs weren't hunting. They were having a panic attack with claws." Ulwin, still glistening with stress slime, but marginally less terrified, raised a gelatinous appendage. "But how did you know? How did you know they were scared and not murder-hungry?" Body language. The ears were back. Weight distribution was wrong for a real attack. Pupils were dilated beyond hunting focus. Add the vocalizations. Those weren't predatory calls. Those were distress signals. Professor Colmouth had recovered some of his composure. His skin settled on a thoughtful teal. "But Miss Eliza, most species cannot read cross-species behavioral cues with that accuracy, especially not apex predators from a planet they've never visited." "Humans can," Eliza said simply. "We evolved doing it." "Elaborate," the professor commanded, slipping back into lecture mode. "This is pedagogically relevant." Eliza stood, aware she was now somehow teaching the class. The universe's irony meter had officially broken. "Earth is weird," she began. "Our evolutionary environment had an unusual concentration of megafauna. Massive predators, prey animals that could stomp you flat. Everything in between. Humans didn't start at the top of the food chain. We clawed our way up by learning to read everything around us." She gestured around the hall. "Most of your species evolved in relatively stable environments. Either you were apex predators with few threats, or prey animals with simple predator avoidance strategies. Humans? We were the awkward middle child. Not strong enough to dominate through force, not fast enough to just run away. So we got creative." "Creative how?" someone called from the back. We learned to read behavior across species lines. We turned wolves into dogs, convinced cats to cohabitate, domesticated horses, elephants, birds. We even befriend apex predators that could absolutely kill us. There are humans who work with tigers, bears, crocodiles, not through dominance, through understanding. Fell's tail lashed in agitation. That's insane. It's survival, Eliza corrected. Earth taught us that the scariest animals aren't always the most dangerous ones. Fear management, ours and theirs, became a survival skill. We don't just fight or flee. We assess, adapt, and sometimes we befriend. A mantis-like student in the upper rows clicked thoughtfully. So humans are what? The galaxy's mediators? You negotiate with predators? More like we're persistent problem solvers, Eliza replied. We spent millennia figuring out how to coexist with things that could kill us. Not because we're naturally brave, because we're naturally stubborn. We looked at wolves and thought, what if we didn't run? What if we stayed and shared our food? We saw wild cats and decided they'd make excellent roommates. We're the species that keeps trying to pet things that bite. A nervous laugh rippled through the hall. But it's more than just domestication, Eliza continued, warming to the topic. It's empathy across species barriers. We preserve predators that hunt us. We rescue animals that serve no practical purpose. We cry over creatures we've never met. Earth has humans who dedicate their entire lives to protecting species that pose genuine threats to human settlements. We relocate bears instead of killing them. We create wildlife corridors so animals can cross our highways safely. We're absurd that way. Professor Colmouth's skin flashed bright yellow. Excitement. The persistence hunting theory. I'd read about it, but never considered the psychological implications. Humans don't just track prey physically. You track them emotionally. You predict behavior by understanding fear, exhaustion, panic. Exactly. Those cubs weren't my enemies. They were 6-month-old juveniles having the worst day of their lives. I just helped them realize that. The lecture hall doors burst open again. This time, it wasn't security. It was 3 members of university administration, led by a crystalline being whose facets were vibrating with barely contained fury. Student designation, Eliza Human, the administrator announced, her voice resonating through the hall like a gavel strike. You are hereby summoned for immediate disciplinary review. Unauthorized interference with containment protocols, endangerment of fellow students, violation of safety regulations. She saved everyone, Olwyn shouted, his voice hitting frequencies that made several students wince. Unauthorized action is still unauthorized, the administrator replied coldly. Professor Colmouth moved forward, all 6 limbs spread in a gesture that Eliza had learned meant serious disagreement. This student prevented casualties. Without her intervention, we would have had... Which is precisely the problem, Professor. A first-year student should not need to intervene. This incident represents a catastrophic failure of your safety protocols. The class erupted, students shouting, defending, arguing. Fell, surprisingly, was among the loudest. The human prevented disaster, Fell declared, her warrior culture apparently valuing competence over species prejudice. You want to punish the only person who kept their head? The administrator's facets rotated through furious patterns. Order! This is not a democracy! But something had shifted in the room. The shared trauma, the collective survival, Eliza's inexplicable calm. It had created a bond. The class had become a unit. It took 2 hours of debate, testimony, and Eliza calmly walking the administrators through exactly what she'd done and why. In the end, they couldn't expel her. Not when every witness corroborated that she'd prevented casualties. Instead, they assigned her to help develop new safety protocols for xenobiology practicals, and offered her a teaching assistant position. Eliza accepted both, mostly because the alternative was being known galaxy-wide as that human who got expelled for calming down murder kittens. 3 days later, she stood in the secure containment facility where the Fang cubs were properly housed. Olwyn had accompanied her, still secreting trace amounts of nervous slime, but mostly recovered. The cubs pressed against the transparent barrier when they saw her, making soft, chirping sounds. "You were terrified, weren't you?" Olwyn asked quietly. Eliza smiled. "Absolutely paralyzed. I just didn't let them see it." "How?" She watched the cubs, still juveniles, still dangerous, still beautiful in their terrible way. "Back on Earth, we learned something important. Fear doesn't mean freeze. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is look at something that could kill you and say, 'Hey, I see you,' and mean it." The middle cub, the one that had stalked her in the lecture hall, pressed closer to the barrier, all 6 eyes focused on her face. Recognition, memory, maybe even something approaching gratitude, though Eliza knew better than to anthropomorphize too much. "They'll be transferred back to Nexu Prime next week," Olwyn said, reading from his datapad. "Conservation Initiative wants them back in proper habitat. Apparently, this incident has triggered a complete review of off-world specimen protocols." "Good," Eliza murmured. "They shouldn't be here. They should be home, with their family group." Behind them, unnoticed, Fel stood in the doorway. She'd been watching for the past 5 minutes. Later that week, she quietly enrolled in Eliza's supplementary course, Earth Fauna Behavioral Analysis and Applications. Turned out, the galaxy's apex warrior culture could still learn a thing or two from persistence hunters who'd befriended wolves. Human weird, Fel thought, reading the course description, but maybe good weird. The kind of weird that kept you alive when every protocol failed and the apex predators were loose. The kind of weird that saw fear and responded with calm. The kind of weird that looked at teeth and claws and said, with absolute sincerity, "Hey there, buddy. You look like you're having a rough day." Fel's scales rippled. What passed for a smile in her species? "Yeah, good weird."